Welcome to The Detail. I am your host, Cathy Antunes, and you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida. With me today is Lorrie Muldowney and Ron Kashden. We're going to be talking about the future of the Van Wezel. Historic preservationists are focusing on the Van Wezel as being worthy of preservation. Lorrie Muldowney is the president of the Sarasota Alliance for Historic Preservation. Ms. Muldowney, you've lived here since 1970. You moved from Bronxville, New York, a place I'm familiar with. And you worked in the city and the county, especially the county, as their historic preservation specialist. Listeners of the show know that Ron Kashden has been here a few times before. Ron, you're a CPA, and among your many financial arenas of expertise, you were the former auditor for and served as auditor for the Schubert Theaters on Broadway. So, Lorrie, can you kick it off for us and share what is the list? What is the organization that has named the Van Wezel, Sarasota's Van Wezel, as worthy of, being a priority for Florida to save?
Yeah. Well, thank you, Cathy. I'd be happy to do that. So the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation is a statewide historic preservation organization. And in fact, I served on their board of directors for a number of years. And when I was on their board, I was the chairman and the co-chairman of their endangered buildings program. And so the program is multifaceted, and it's very central to the mission of the Florida Trust to assist community members in recognizing, documenting, preserving their significant historic buildings. So the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation has a program which they call their 11 to Save. Every year, the Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, as well as the Sarasota Alliance for Historic Preservation, as well as the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I'm sure many other organizations, recognize significant buildings. And so this year, last month, in fact, at their 2023 conference, they announced their list of 11 buildings to save. And we were very pleased that the Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall had been included amongst that list. All of them have value to their communities. I think that if I had to look and say, what's the one unifying aspect of these nominations, that's what I would say. That they are places that help define their communities.
Most people who live in Sarasota moved here from somewhere else. And while you're not a native, you certainly have lived here for over 50 years. Mm-hmm. My kids once joked, in Florida, there's a condo that George Washington slept in, which of course there isn't, right? but highlighting that, the history here, it actually is old history going back to the 1500s, but we don't have the same kind of preservation in Florida as exists up north, right? In our original 13 colonies type building. Mm-hmm. Would you share, where is Florida in its track record with historic preservation? Because I think a lot of people feel maybe Florida hasn't done the best job of doing that.
Well, just to sort of react to what you said first, I think it's important for us to recognize as a community, and certainly as preservationists, that time does not stand still. And so growing up, the buildings that might have been significant to me, 30 or 40 years ago, those buildings have perhaps gained in significance. But I also now appreciate that there are buildings the same age as I that are in fact eligible for listing in the National Register and the local register. I very clearly remember when I was at the dedication service the first time for a building that was the same age as I, Victor Lundy's Community Center, and I realized that I was indeed a mid-century modern. So what makes Sarasota really interesting, and if I get off track, please feel free to redirect me. But
Mhm.
what makes Florida interesting is that we are really in many communities dealing with more current history. And certainly in Sarasota, when I came to Sarasota after graduating from the University of Florida with my degree in historic preservation, I figured I'd be looking at old Spanish buildings and old wood frame buildings. And certainly I did over the course of my long career. But what is much more interesting to people, and what many more people come here to see, are our mid-century modern buildings. The Sarasota School of Architecture, I mean, it's real. This is why people come. I have toured folks that have come from all over the world to look at our buildings on numerous occasions. So for Sarasota, that has been our unique challenge. I think in many ways, that's true of all of Florida, that we were a place that, because there were so many Army air bases here, there were a lot of military moving through, certainly this part of the state of Florida, in training for World War II, and a lot of those vets returned to Sarasota.
Mm.
When we think about our track record in Sarasota, I, of course, having worked in preservation, I think probably too often of the important buildings that we've lost. And, I think about what might have happened differently, or how we could have improved our efforts. So there are certainly communities that I think began looking at, perhaps more traditional communities that began looking at preservation in the 1960s, when the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, and recognized the significance of those places. In the 1960s, when we had so many highway projects and housing projects, there were a lot of historic resources lost, and it was sort of in reaction to that the National Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1964.
Okay, I just, so we are creating a video here, which I'll put up on YouTube if listeners would like to check that out. And I'm showing a photograph of the Van Wezel. And can you explain, and I know, Ron, you may have something to share on this too, because you've studied the topic. Why is the building important? There are some people, I think, who may not appreciate the architecture or understand why this building, the Van Wezel, matters. So what is it? What is it about the building that's worth saving?
Well, I'll begin if you'd like.
Yes.
And, as preservationists, this, of course, is what we talk about a lot when we go to preservation conferences and peer-to-peer communications. And I think what I have found interesting and challenging about the profession, again, is that time doesn't stand still, that we have to reframe our thinking about significance, really every year, every day. A building becomes older and gains significance. Generally speaking, to be eligible for historic designation on either the national or the local levels, a building has to be 50 years old or older. And so we know that the Van Wezel qualifies in that category. But I should add that that's a guideline. There are exceptions to that rule. And in fact, here in Sarasota, because of buildings associated with the Sarasota School of Architecture movement, we have had buildings listed in the National Register of Historic Places that have been significantly younger than 50 years of age. The cabanas at the Sanderling Beach Club are one example. And at the local register, we've had some examples as well. So when we talk about what makes a building significant, generally speaking, it can qualify in one of several areas, either because of its architecture, or because of its an association with an important person, or because of its an association with an important event, or because it in some way characterizes an identifiable historical context. So in evaluating the Van Wezel, and I should say it has never been it has never been nominated to the National Register, but certainly people have looked at it and thought about its significance. When I have looked at it and thought about it, it seems to me that it's quite likely that it qualifies in all of those areas because of its significant architecture. And as we've discussed at some public forums, its association with Taliesin Architects, which is the legacy firm of Frank Lloyd Wright. We also know that it was associated with some really important people in Sarasota County history, particularly David Cohen, who established the Sarasota Orchestra, Ken Thompson, who was the city manager here and in fact held the title of being the longest standing city manager in the state of Florida. And so we know that there were some very important people associated with the building. And then finally, I think, and this is always the one that kind of interests me the most, is how the building really personified, I think, the optimism of this community following World War II, that great things indeed lie ahead. And I mean, I just think the building is so exuberant and colorful and a place for the community to celebrate. So those are the things that I think make it important to us as a community. And now, 50, 60 years hence, it has memories. I mean, and there again, what I've learned over the course of my career, I mean, I love architecture and I can get excited talking about different building styles, but mostly what people care about are places that embody their memory. And there simply could not be a space in Sarasota that did that in a more important way than the Van Wezel Performing Arts Hall. I think everybody has memories there. So.
Yeah, well, I think, I saw actually both of my sons graduated from high school, at the Van Wezel. They walked across that stage. It's shaped like a seashell. I think a lot of people who live here may not know that. And the nickname for the building is the Purple Cow, but the color purple is connected to that seashell. So, maybe Ron, do you want to share what you know about it, and Lorrie can fill in those gaps?
Yep, and Lorrie, definitely, if I get some of the details, let me know. That's a fascinating story because not only is it a Taliesin associates building, so connected with Frank Lloyd Wright, but there's a personal connection with Frank Lloyd Wright's family with the building, insofar as the architect that did it, Wes Peters, was Frank Lloyd Wright's son-in-law and was involved in a lot of the more significant structures that Wright did, including supervising the construction of the Guggenheim. But where the shell comes in is Frank Lloyd Wright's wife, who I believe how the story goes, in addition to a love of the US, Wright also had an affinity to Japan and spent a lot of time in Japan and had found a purple shell in Japan that his wife loved the color of the shell and wanted to show it, present it to the public because she thought it, she just thought it was so beautiful. And with the shell, what is interesting about that story is there's multiple stories with that. So there's one that Wright's wife found this purple shell, became enamored, and that was the impetus to the color. But also, apparently Wes Peters had a collection of shells in Florida, in Sarasota, that he was trying to figure out what inspiration should he use for this building to try and connect the building to the community, because it's that community connection in addition to the land that was so important to Wright's organization. And apparently he had thrown out a couple of shells on the table and said, this is the inspiration, this is what I was going to use. And it's that kind of wavy structure that you see on the roof that was the attempt to emulate.
And abalone shell, or what is the name of, do you happen to know the name of the shell? It's the kind like the Shell gas station.
Yes.
Where it has that folded kind of
Yes.
undulating surface. And that's how the roof is constructed, in that interior purple of the shell, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, I just want to give people who are listening, an idea. And I did not know that about the Van Wezel. I always thought it was a cool color. I love color. And I think we don't do enough, to celebrate color in our built environment. So when I moved here, I was like, wow, that is a gutsy, beautiful purple. I thought it was great. But I had no idea. I didn't know about the roof being, like the interior of a shell, and I didn't know the origin of the color story. So it's pretty interesting. And never heard about the Frank Lloyd Wright connection and Taliesin until, this recent movement to build something new and kind of put the purple cow out to pasture. So I'm going to share a quote that I found in doing a bit of research for the show. And this is from Carl Abbotts. Maybe Lorrie, if you don't mind reading that, and then I'd be curious to know your thoughts on the Sarasota School and the Van Wezel.
Sure. Creative architecture is symbolic of the culture of Sarasota. The internationally recognized Sarasota School of Architecture is one of Sarasota's most important cultural exports. In some special cities, there are iconic buildings that speak to the culture of the place. The Van Wezel is Sarasota's icon.
And that was said by Carl Abbott.
Carl Abbott, who is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, and in fact is a member of the Sarasota School of Architect. He's considered second generation because he worked directly with Paul Rudolph, who was the father of the movement. So we're very fortunate to have Carl still vocal and still participating in these kinds of important community conversations.
Yeah. And it's interesting to me. It seems like there's a cognitive dissonance in the community at large about the Van Wezel, because on the one hand, you've got a respected leader in the architectural community, Carl Abbott, calling the Van Wezel our cultural icon, celebrating the creative architecture of Sarasota, and the Van Wezel is like the premier example of that. The Van Wezel's won a lot of awards, and we can specify those a bit later, but it is recognized in the country and the world as a premier venue for its size and its class. And you'll hear people at the Van Wezel, administration or the foundation, on one hand, they'll celebrate these things. And over the years, we've heard that. But then in 2014, and it wasn't the first effort to kind of redevelop that bayfront area, because the Van Wezel sits on the water. It has a lot of surface parking, which I think most everyone agrees that is not the highest and yet best use for waterfront land, right? So there's good reason to want to look at what's going on there and maybe reconfigure. But it was this 2014 Bayfront 2020. At that point, it's called Bayfront 2020, in that it was going to be done in 2020. Well, it's 2023, and we're still working on it, which is fine. But that's when the Van Wezel started to be dog chow to some people. Honestly, when I hear about it, I'm like, oh, this great building that's so cool and different. Now, you started to hear people talk about it being no good. Maybe Ron, I'll toss that one to you. What's your take? And we're going to get into the money, but any thoughts about that cognitive dissonance?
Absolutely. And I agree with you. Anyone that pulls into the parking lot to a show for the Van Wezel has to look out in the bay and say, why are we using all this land for parking? It just doesn't intuitively make sense. But I would think there are very few people that look at that land and say, the best use would be another building. I think most people would take a look at this and say, why isn't this parkland? Why is this green space that people can walk out to? And I got to give kudos to the Bay Initiative that they're trying to turn it back to green space.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of the natural progression of it. So that cognitive dissonance, I think, is resulting for people that have gotten stuck on an idea. And we can discuss the origin of that idea, but they're now trying to fit the idea that they have in their heads and trying to mold reality to that, rather than looking at the space and saying what intuitively makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to share because there was in 2014 or thereabouts, the company was hired to kind of do some creative vision work, and I went to a lot of these meetings, but take the suggestions of the community. And I think 90% or more of people would say, yeah, a parking lot on the water is not the best use of the land. So to your point, Ron, getting this to be parkland makes total sense. But there was another effort, and we need a new performing arts hall. And part of it was the symphony needs a better space. They're too cramped in the space that they were using. And so it was just a picture was made, and it's a nice picture of two performing arts halls. One is the brand spanking new one, and then the Van Wezel. And what I witnessed over time is that because there was a drawing, there were people out there who were promoting the idea of a new performing arts hall, including those working on behalf of the Van Wezel Foundation, who were basically like, no, we want get rid of the old, we want the new. And there's an important thing that changed. People have a valid point about the acoustics maybe not being optimal for a symphony, but the symphony has made it clear now that they're building their own new building out east near I-75 at Cattleman and Fruitville. So the need for a symphony hall there was no longer there. And there's never actually been, beyond the drawing that I can see, an actual viable financial plan that has been vetted and put forward. Is that fair to say, Ron?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And all of that's fair to say. And bringing the orchestra into the conversation was a key part of the history, insofar as there was booking conflicts between the wonderful programming that Mary was bringing in.
Mary Benzel, who runs the Van Wezel. Yeah.
Yep. And she was getting a lot of shows that people wanted to see, as well at the same time that the orchestra was getting quite a bit of success. So there was always this contention over who gets the space. So to some extent, that absolutely made sense. At some point, both events can't really fit there. But with the orchestra moving out, one begins to wonder, well, then what was the need? Because I agree with you, back in 2010, when we had done the extensive renovations for the building, or 2000, around 2000, and then again in 2010, when they wanted to improve the way the building could host touring companies, Broadway touring companies, and they extended the tower, that did harm the acoustics of it. And the orchestra had to end up having a movable shell just to try and get the acoustics back. All of those are really valid problems and should be addressed, but I agree with you. Once the orchestra has decided this is no longer our venue and we are not going to consider it anymore,
Yeah.
People didn't pivot, even though the underlying reason for doing so did.
Yeah, and I'm just going to share another rendering, but to kind of close in on what was called the SPAC, or is Sarasota Performing Arts Center, was the acronym being used to tout, a whole new venue. Once again, it's interesting to me. There's this really, cool looking building. It's very modern looking, and there's a lot of green space. But there's no parking garage. And if you're going to get rid of all your surface parking, those cars have to go somewhere. So while these drawings were really pretty and exciting, if you wanted to get a community behind you, when you kind of really look under the hood, and you don't have to look that far, I was like, where's the parking going to be? You're actually adding a whole nother event venue, but you've taken away all the parking. Where's it going to go?
Mhm.
Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, the city, once again, a obvious insight that people, when they start exploring this, say people need to get to the venue. And once they're there, what do they do with their vehicle? The city realized that early on, if they were going to continue down this path, they needed to solve the parking problem. So they hired consultants, parking consultants, to take a look at the area. And the parking consultants had done their studies and found out that if they had stuck with the current plans that everybody was working towards, there was going to be a deficit of 500 parking spots. So where do they find those 500 parking spots? And the consultants took a look around, and they found out that there was no site that was within, and this is expertise terminology, what they call feasible walking distance, which is walking distance that would be reasonable for someone to do.
Yeah.
And so they realized if the city was going to solve that parking problem, they would need external parking garages, and those external parking garages will be beyond the walking distance that most people will travel.
Right.
So that means not only are you're not going to be able to pull up to the venue like you do now, you're going to have to park in a remote spot and take a shuttle bus back and forth.
Yeah. So these, beautiful pictures, they look great. It's like, well, why would you want to say no to that? That looks terrific. But the practical reality is that this picture was never going to work.
Yep.
I mean, and in a way, that's also true of the money. And I want to get to that. That's important. But Lorrie, when we're talking about the value of historic preservation, I've read that, and I know in my own travels, and, I might be a little different because I'd studied history, and I love that, but being able to visit historic sites or buildings is a big motivator when I travel. We enjoy doing that, my husband and I. Can you speak to what the value is to preservation in dollars and cents when it comes to, the economy?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much for this opportunity, because it is important, and we all know a broad range of people, and we certain things motivate certain people to travel. I'm kind of like you, Cathy. When I travel, I'm usually looking for an historic site, but other people may not be. So very early on, preservationists recognized that although we as a group are passionate about historic preservation, there has to be an economic argument, that we can't just expect that our charming good looks will convince people of this. So,
Right.
So preservationists have been working hand in hand with economists and transportation planners and environmental planners. We are cohorts in these conversations. And so when we talk about the economics of historic preservation, there's one person who stands out from the crowd as having done some of the most interesting and innovative work. And his name is Donovan Ripkema. And his company is a company called Place Economics. And he actually worked here in Sarasota many years ago when preservationists were evaluating the feasibility of preserving the John Ringling Towers, and helped a lot in doing some economic analysis, to strengthen the preservation argument. Of course, in that case, the building went on, and we did not succeed. But it was all
for people listening. That was the Ritz-Carlton is there now. Yeah.
It was also a long time ago. And remember, I remarked earlier that the National Historic Preservation Act was only created in the 1960s. So historic preservation is a young movement, if you will. And so practitioners from the 80s learned a lot from the people from the 60s. And in turn, now in 2023, we know a lot more than people did a mere 20 or 30 years ago, because the profession is relatively recent. At any rate, Place Economics is a company comprised of folks with backgrounds in economics primarily, and they do studies all over the country to look at historic preservation and its positive economic impacts. In the last year or two, they've produced a document which is called 24 Reasons Historic Preservation is Good for Communities. And we at the Sarasota Alliance for Historic Preservation have been promoting this document, giving it to elected officials, talking about it at public meetings. And it essentially draws on economic studies that have been done in communities around the country, 50, 60, 70, over numerous years of work by the good people at Place Economics. So it talks about heritage tourism, it talks about jobs, it talks about downtown revitalization, and so there are a lot of reasons that historic preservation is good for communities. One that I've thought about heritage tourism and downtown revitalization, but for instance, older buildings, because of the fact that their amenity levels may be lower, and so their rents are also lower, are a good place for small businesses to start. They suit young businesses, and they can help serve as business incubators. Similarly, older buildings, because they're at a different place economically than the very top end office structures or residential structures, can promote diversity in terms of age in our communities, where young people getting established might be able to find a site that suits them, as well as older people who maybe are downsizing. So there are an awful lot of good reasons. I wanted to also add that the state of Florida also did some important studies about the economic benefits of historic preservation about 20 years ago, partnering with the University of Florida, and that has been updated. That was more focused on, certainly it was focused on residential land values, because that's a question that comes up a lot. I don't want to get too much off topic here. However, people will often ask about, if I designate my home, they will ask me whether that will affect their property values. And based on the research that was done for the state of Florida by the University of Florida, in fact, property values for structures within historic districts appreciate at a slightly greater rate than property values for homes which are not within historic districts. And so that is a statistic that I've turned people to frequently in these conversations.
That's great. Everybody, if you're just joining us, you are listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida. If drinking is no longer fun for you and separates you from other people, you can attend an AA meeting. They've been there. More information is available by phone at 941-951 6810 or online at aasrq.org. We are talking about the future of the Van Wezel. It was recently named as one of 11 buildings to save in Florida by an organization whose name escapes me right now. It's the Lorrie. It's the Florida Trust.
The Florida Trust for Historic Preservation, which is based in Tallahassee.
preservation. So Lorrie Muldowney, who is the president of the Sarasota Alliance for Historic Preservation, and Ron Kashden, who is a CPA and was the auditor for the Schubert Theaters in New York, are joining me to discuss what's going on. It's nearly a decade now. We've been talking since 2014 about redeveloping the bayfront land near the Van Wezel. So Ron, let's talk about, because like I said, there's been this weird dissonance with, here's the Van Wezel, it's the best performing arts venue in its class. It's winning all these awards. It has nicknames among performers because, you know, the purple something, right? We call it the purple cow, but it's well known and has won awards. And you've got the Sarasota School of Architects saying it is an iconic building. Okay. And then when the Bayfront 2020 initiative started happening, there were a lot of complaints. It suddenly became a throwaway. Yeah, we've got to get rid of it. Oh, it's wet, you know, that there's flooding issues. To the point where there were claims that it wasn't structurally sound. And I think, you know, strategic neglect can be a strategy to get buildings torn down. But the city actually commissioned an engineering report to analyze the condition of the Van Wezel. This report back in March of 2022, when the city commission, and you correct me if I'm wrong, Ron, this is my recollection. The city commission was approving an agreement regarding a new performing arts center. And the engineering report, that the assumption in play was that the Van Wezel wasn't structurally sound. The engineering report, which the city had, which had been commissioned by city administration, was not included in the background information in that meeting. A material, important report that we paid for as taxpayers was left out of the information packet. And the findings of that engineering report were conclusive, they were clear, and they said, this building can be maintained and is sound, and it wouldn't be expensive to make whatever fixes were needed. Am I right on that?
Absolutely. So the city commissioned Karen's engineering back in October of 2021 to do a cursory review of the structure. And quoting from the actual final report that they had, they said, for the next 7 to 10 years, Karen's does not see a need for repair or any appreciable maintenance of the framing of the structure. And they went on that repairs and maintenance beyond that period would largely depend on the level of maintenance. And the largest cause of deterioration of the structural framing will be, in essence, lack of maintenance for the skin. So in essence, Karen's is coming out and saying, as long as you maintain this building, we see it as sound. And backing up what you were describing and what Lorrie was going about, from an accountant, from the financial aspects, both as an accountant, as a resident, the Van Wezel is one of the most important, maybe the most valuable asset that the city owns. And I understand groups wanting to have aspirational goals, but it was really disheartening that the tack they took would be to denigrate the most valuable asset that the city has, you know, trying to take that value down, which really harms all the residents, all the taxpayers. You know, rather than trying to build up an image, you're absolutely right that the strategy was, we need to take that down. And so what you have on the screen is a continuation of that report, talking about enhancements. So they've said right off the bat that This building is sound, and all you need is simple maintenance for it to continue to be sound. If you go beyond that, if you want to have environmental sustainability, flood proofing, they talked about that, of handling a storm surge when people get worried about hurricanes. It's a rough estimate, but the numbers they're talking about is $1.8 million. And while that seems like a lot, the new, the rough estimate is around $500 million.
Right.
So it's hard to equate the two. There's a false equivalency there.
Yeah. I'm going to switch over because Mark Smith was elected in 2022. Mark Smith is an architect. He represents District 4, Siesta Key, and he made a recommendation to keep the Van Wezel, and just in a communication to Kelly, your wife, Ron, who has been just indefatigable. She is such energy advocating for preservation. He says here, Mark Smith, an architect, it would be financial negligence not to explore the floodproofing option at perhaps 1/10 of the cost, and that it's premature. We've seen this spring that this whole architect selection process for a building we're not even clear we can pay for, and yet they're choosing an architect. It's premature to select the architect for the new performing arts hall when due diligence as to whether the Van Wezel building can be retrofitted and remodeled to be floodproofed in accordance with FEMA guidelines hasn't been performed. I mean, and the Karen's engineering report said, yes, indeed, it can be floodproofed. So, and I'll end with a final, to toss this into the mix. This was back in 2018. Harold Bubel he was with the Herald Tribune for many years and was the architect columnist for the Herald Tribune. And he was talking about this movement that was growing by the Sarasota Bayfront Planning Organization to make over those 53 acres, many of which is parking. And I think everybody knows that it's better to have green space than parking. But he was advocating again that these buildings and the Van Wezel, he says, even though some very qualified people, some of whom have even worked in the Van Wezel, believe it to be functionally obsolete, I am hoping that the firm that was hired will include it as part of its plan. And he goes into how the building, the Van Wezel, would be eligible for the National Register of Historic Places in 2019. And he goes into the history, as you both have, of the Taliesin, Frank Lloyd Wright, his son, all of that being relevant. I was really disappointed because when this decision was made in March of 2022 by the city commission to enter into what I consider to be a really deeply flawed agreement regarding the future of the Van Wezel. And when you write as a citizen to public officials, those emails are public documents, right? And there were people who, you're going to have conflict in a community. There are people I really admire and respect who have been supporting the idea of a new performing arts hall and have, I think, it's sidestepping the money issue, how expensive it would be. And we'll get into the whole market aspect. We don't have that much time left. But there was this email where there were people high-fiving each other and saying, hey, you did a great job here, you did a great job there, blah, blah, blah. But the attitude of the quote unquote winners towards those like you, Ron, who were bringing up cogent, rational objections that simply can't be ignored about the money. They were calling it kabuki theater, just very disrespectful. Frankly, I find nasty and irresponsible, given that, yeah, okay, you won, but have you considered that you are taking our community into a massive waste of time and talent and resources because you're unwilling to actually look at the money and the logistics and reckon with how the plan you've come up with is ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah. What's also interesting about it is back then when they were talking about Kabuki Theater, the way they were going to get this financed would require approval from the county as well, due to the machinations of the TIF. And getting back to Mark Smith,
which is tax increment financing. So
yes,
county TIF money would be needed to fund this. Still nowhere near the $500 million, right, Mark?
Oh.
But yeah, so the county money was needed, and please go ahead.
And Mark Smith, who is an architect, also happens to be a county commissioner, so he would have to be a part of that approval process. And in that email that you had shown to the viewers and listeners before, he concludes that email with the following sentence: I believe it, referring to the Van Wezel, can be saved, that it should be saved, that we have to stop demolishing our history.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the attitude of the people that ultimately have to approve the financing. And the people that were denigrating the building, the people that were giving the high fives, were ignoring that they were never going to get that financing.
Right.
But the people that had to approve that financing never gave an approval for it.
No, but they were assuming the presentation that they had the money.
Yep.
I mean, it was just like,
yes, it was a disconnect. Yeah.
To speak to, what I would call the larger cultural, it's pun intended, I guess, but we're talking about a cultural icon, right? This is a place where people go for entertainment, for important civic events, like graduations, like public speakers. So this place matters. And the culture around the decision-making among our elected leaders and the staff, people don't like to ask these questions. I was like, everyone's a nice guy, everybody's a nice guy, nice gal. We all love our kids and mom and apple pie and all that stuff. But if you have an engineering report and you are a city staff and you are not providing it to the people elected to make the decision to the tune of $500 million, where half of that money, first of all, the foundation's supposed to come up with, and there's no evidence that they have anything close to, $250 million. So that's one piece. But then you're asking the people you serve, residents, to fund debt, right? And you have the audacity not to provide the engineering report to the commission and public. I just don't even know what to do with that. It is, for me, that's civic malpractice. What's going on, right? And the way that people want to ignore reality, and I think it's a cultural issue these days. But for something that has been so important in our history, it's been shocking to me. And I think we need a little bit of a cultural change, a big cultural change when it comes to the quality of our decisions as a community. Lorrie, have you seen this kind of attitude before, because let's face it, there's a lot of people who want to build new things, and there's money to be made in building new things, and often the people or the organizations that are most able to fund major projects is government. Other people's money, but yet it's all of our money. Is this something you've seen in your work when it comes to tactics for destroying historic buildings? Just ignoring information?
Well, that's a big.
It's a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we have a unique struggle in Sarasota, because so many folks here are more recent residents.
Mhm.
And so it is difficult to, to have a collective memory and to kind of appreciate that, recognize that, agree on the importance of that. So I think in that way, Sarasota and Florida, maybe to a lesser degree, the whole state, we are presented with that. Let's see. I mean, talking about this instance, or it seems pretty unique to me. I think it more speaks perhaps to the times and the disconnects that we have as a culture right now than it does to the preservation conversation per se. As professionals, we all can certainly agree to disagree, but you still hold your fellow professional, you value their opinion. And in my role as the county's historical resources manager, certainly giving accurate, complete, and unbiased information to the elected officials was at the top of my list in terms of being very important. It was a conversation I would have from time to time, even with community members, because I had to explain to community members that as a county's preservation planner, I would not be the one that would be chaining myself to an historic building. That in fact, that was a community activist's role. As a professional planner and preservationist, my role was to provide quality information so that our policymakers could make the correct judgments.
Sure.
So that was a conversation I often had.
Yeah. So getting back to the lack of information, right? Relatively speaking, when we're talking about public debt for an entertainment venue, in the city of Sarasota, and this was the beginning of my activism days, there was talk of $100 million for a new stadium for the Red Sox. When we had Ed Smith Stadium, they wanted to build it in Payne Park, which that was before you lived here, Ron, but which would have made your wife nuts. And it made a lot of us nuts, right? And that was before Payne Park was a really nice park, but they just wanted to take it over. And then God knows what was going to happen with Ed Smith, because people like, myself, but other people too, we got involved, and they refurbished Ed Smith Stadium for $32 million. And they didn't, there wasn't this incredible rejiggering and exploitation of resources to satisfy a corporate sports team. That was $32 million. That is the largest amount. I'm sure they've spent more since then. But as the cost of the project, that was a lot. And that's the largest I've ever heard of. In the county, there's a limit on how much you can borrow without a referendum. It's tied to CPI. I think these days it's probably like 23 million. Legacy Trail Extension was like 20 million, and we voted on that. This project, the way it's being proposed, represents 10 times, more than 10 times that amount of money. It is absolutely massive. The amount of money, not the county, but that the city, a city of roughly 50 to 60,000 people, would be expected to go into debt in our municipality to the tune of about $200 million. The county's never even done anything like this. And they're claiming that you need a larger venue. The marketing dynamics completely squash the viability of a large venue in Sarasota being able to compete with Tampa or Fort Myers. So Ron, we have a few minutes left, but can this is a tough one. Can you talk about why a bigger venue in Sarasota isn't going to make it financially? And then any thoughts on the magnitude of the debt that's being asked?
Absolutely. So two aspects. First, tackling, do we need a larger venue?
Yeah.
And I looked at that two different ways. First, I took a look to see, well, what's the current capacity? What's the occupancy of the Van Wezel on average? And on average, 89% of the shows have available seats on any given show.
Mhm.
So that means that only 11% are ever sold out. So clearly, there's availability right now. There's existing and excess capacity. So if you had a larger venue, you would just have more empty seats most of the time. The other aspect that tackles that is Tampa. Because of our proximity to Tampa,
Mhm.
Tampa is a larger market. So even if we had a larger venue, the problem is that Tampa can they can actually outbid us on some shows just because they have a larger marketplace. And
Like
there's
like Taylor Swift. Taylor
Yes,
Swift is not coming to Sarasota.
exactly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we do get we're getting Hamilton this year. So
Mhm.
it's not like we can get, we don't get top quality shows.
Right.
It's just the argument of a larger venue, somehow we could outbid Tampa
Right.
is just fallacious.
Because the venue isn't what dictates it as much as the market. And we are just not the market that Tampa is. And when Tampa nails down those dates, they impose a blackout period, or 90 miles. When they're contracting with Taylor Swift, they're saying, and you're not going to perform within a 90-mile radius. Ron, I just got a minute, but this is so much money that's being proposed, and just your thoughts on the departure from financial reality and your efforts. I know you tried, and you're continuing to talk to people about the dollars and cents.
Yeah, just every time they come up with a new financing arrangement or pie in the sky, hey, we can finance it this way. They originally said we can finance this just with ticket surcharges. And quickly, by doing the math, you found out that tickets would double. Well, that doesn't make sense. Okay,
Right.
we'll finance it with the TIF. Well, the county came back and said, we don't have an appetite for $500 million. So now that's off the table. So, they keep on scrambling it gets back to that cognitive dissonance of they have a vision and trying to mold reality to their vision rather than taking a step back and saying, well, this is the reality that's presented to us. What can we do with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Lorrie, any parting thoughts on the value of keeping an old building for people to ponder here?
Well, I would speak to as a community, the importance of memory, and that memory is embodied in buildings like the Van Wezel. We're really very lucky to have it. When you think about, the size of our community in 1970 when it opened, that's when I moved here. And, we were a much, much smaller city. And it's quite phenomenal to think that we could have attracted that kind of an architectural talent, and that we had leaders who had the vision to create it. So,
So we need to value
it's a very, very unique, very, very significant building, also identified by the University of Florida as one of in their 100 most important buildings list. So, like the performance aspects of the whole, the architectural aspects have also been very well recognized around the country.
Well, I want to thank you, Lorrie Muldowney and Ron Kashden, for joining me today. If you didn't catch the first part, our shows are always available immediately after the broadcast on the WSLR archive at WSLR.org. If you are drinking, if drinking is no longer fun for you and separates you from other people, you can attend an AA meeting. They've been there. More information is available by phone at 941-951-6810 or online at aasrq.org. You have been listening to The Detail on WSLR 96.5 LPFM in Sarasota, Florida. Be sure to stay tuned for more public affairs programming here on this station. Thanks so much for listening, and make it a great day.